Yeah, bookcast, you ready? Bookcast, where you can read a chapter a day, learn some vocabulary. Let's get started right away. We can break down the story elements. Let's learn. See, I can start it off, but then it's your turn. Tricky long words, we can do it, no problem. Wanna learn the definition? Yeah, we can solve it. We gon' have fun, cause reading is the best. So tune in if you're ready for a bookcast. Yeah.
Hey, awesome readers! Welcome to Bookcast. I am your host, Elizabeth Langs. Thanks for coming back and joining us for Chapter 3 of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I want to say thank you again to those of you that are using the hashtag Bookcast. I really appreciate it, and I love seeing all of your creativity, so keep it up. Also, if you have not had a chance to look at the task cards I've mentioned from Tori from Teachers Pay Teachers, I'm going to encourage you again to check them out and see if there's something you think they'd be helpful to you. It's a great resource and it will help extend the conversation beyond the podcast. So I will share that link again. So if you're looking for how to find that, find me on Instagram or on Facebook and I will have the link there. So before we start Chapter 3, let's go back and quickly review Chapters 1 and 2 so we can kind of refresh our memory and be sure that we understand where we're going in Chapter 3. So in Chapter 1, we start off our book in Sleepy Hollow, which is a town. So that's the setting of our story, where it's taking place. And we are introduced to Ichabod Crane as our main character. And we learn that he is a teacher and that he doesn't really have a place to live, so he stays with the families of his students. And we also are hearing the murmurings of the people in Sleepy Hollow discussing an idea of the Headless Horseman, which we saw in Chapter 2 starts to kind of take over Ichabod Crane's thoughts. And that's where that internal conflict came in, was he's reading and learning about ghosts and goblins, and he has to combat all those thoughts with his own thoughts of how great his life actually is. And then we also see him singing hymns as well. At the end of Chapter 3, we are introduced to a new character. And at the end of Chapter 3, if you remember, he says that he met a woman. So in Chapter 3, we're going to learn who that is. So the vocab for Chapter 3, we have a couple words. The first word is prosperous. And prosperous means successful or wealthy. The second word is inherit. So inherit means to receive something as an heir to the death of the previous holder. So if you had someone you know and they died and they left you their house, that means you inherited it. So you took it on as your own. The next one is not necessarily a vocab word, but it's something I want to be sure that you understand. In the book, they say rose-colored glasses, and that's a phrase that means that you're optimistic or positively perceiving something. The last vocab word for this chapter is parlor, and a parlor is a sitting room in a house. So now that we know those words, we're going to go ahead and get started. Make sure you have your journal, because at the end of this chapter, I have a couple questions again that I would love for you to journal about. All right, let's go ahead and get started with Chapter 3. Miss Van Tassel, Ichabod Crane said one evening, "Your voice was just marvelous tonight. You are certainly making great progress." Ichabod had just finished giving his little group of singers their weekly music lesson. Katrina Van Tassel, the young lady he spoke to, looked at him through her eyelashes. "Thank you, Master Crane," she said. "You are too kind." She threw him a very sweet smile, which he quickly returned. "Please give my best wishes to your mother and father," Ichabod said as she started for home. "I will," answered the girl. "I'm sure they would be happy to have you visit sometime soon." The schoolmaster's Adam's apple moved up and down. He blushed with happiness. He kept staring down the road long after Katrina had disappeared, imagining her in his mind's eye. "Katrina," he sighed to himself. Katrina Van Tassel was the only child of one of the most prosperous Dutch farmers of those parts. There's our first word, prosperous. She was plump as a partridge and as soft and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's luscious peaches. She was famous for her beauty and just as famous for her family's riches, which she would someday inherit. There's our other word. Of course, not everyone saw her through rose-colored glasses the way Ichabod did. "That little snip," one farmer said of her, "why, she's a flirt and she's stuck on herself. Just look at the way she dresses." It was true that Katrina liked to dress up in the bright gold jewelry that her great-grandmother had brought from Europe. Her skirt was shockingly short for those days, all the better to show off the prettiest foot and ankle in the neighborhood. Ichabod had a soft spot for all women, so it's not surprising that he fell for such a pretty girl as Katrina, especially when he found out how rich her family was. "Welcome, schoolmaster," boomed old Baltus Van Tassel when Ichabod paid the family a visit. "Katrina has spoken very highly of you." Katrina's father welcomed Ichabod with a hearty slap on the back. "Shh, shh, she has?" Ichabod stammered. "Why, of course, she's by far my most talented singing student. Her voice is just like a nightingale's. I declare it is." "Oh, she's full of stories about you," Van Tassel said. "She says you're the smartest man she's ever met." "Well, I don't know about that." Very pleased with himself, Ichabod looked down at his big feet. As soon as he had a chance, he also looked all around the Van Tassel farm, which stood in a fine spot on the banks of the Hudson River. The barn was as big as a church, full to overflowing with grain and hay. Rows of plump pigeons cooed from its roof. Sleek, fat hogs were lounging comfortably in their pens, or strolling out now and then to sniff the air. A flock of snow-white geese, along with a squad of ducks, drifted lazily in the pond. Several big turkeys went gobbling around the farmyard as if they owned it. And to top it off, a magnificent rooster strutted across the yard. He flapped his wings and crowed with pride and happiness. Then he scratched in the earth to find some grubs for his family of hens and chicks. "My, what a fine farm you have," Ichabod told Katrina's father. "I can't help admiring all your animals. They're so handsome, so well fed." In fact, Ichabod's mouth was watering. Everywhere he looked, he saw not animals, but food: ham and bacon, beef and sausages. When he looked at the pond, he saw geese swimming in their gravy and ducks swimming in an onion sauce. Seeing at the pigs, he imagined them roasted with apples in their mouths. He thought about turkey stuffed with brown from the oven. He could even see the rooster plucked and cooked, lying on its back and ready to be carved. "You have a good eye for livestock," said the proud Baltus Van Tassel. "Come into the house. My wife has been dying to meet you." Everything about the house told Ichabod of the family's wealth. Outside were harnesses and nets for taking loads of fish from the river. Huge bags of wool stood ready to be spun into yarn. Inside the walls were hung with colorful Indian corn and strings of dried apples and peaches and red peppers. "This is our best parlor." There's our word, said Miss Van Tassel, proud to show off her home to the schoolmaster. The polished wooden table shone like a mirror. In the corner she opened a cupboard so that Ichabod could admire their treasure of old silver. When he'd concluded his very pleasant visit, Ichabod headed home on foot, determined that someday these rich fields, these orchards loaded with fruit, would be his. "Who knows," he said to himself, "I may even sell everything and invest the money in an enormous piece of land out west. They say that's where fortunes are to be made these days." Yes, he could see it already. He and the lovely Katrina heading out on a loaded wagon for Tennessee or Kentucky, or Lord knows where. He even imagined that they already had a family of children who would go with them. But it was one thing to imagine himself courting the rich and beautiful girl, and quite another thing to win her heart. So that is the end of chapter 3. And what I would like to do right now is I'd like to look at motivation. So motivation is the reason behind a character's actions or behavior. And their motivation can be either intrinsic or extrinsic. So intrinsic means that you are doing something to learn or to have emotional well-being or peace. Extrinsic motivation means you are behaving or acting to get money or power or some sort of physical reward. So in this text, we see some motivation on Ichabod's part in regards to Miss Van Tassel, to Katrina. So I want to take a peek at page 32 and look at where I see examples of his motivation. So if you flip back to page 32, at the very bottom it says, Ichabod had a soft spot for all women, so it's not surprising that he fell for such a pretty girl as Katrina, especially when he found out how rich her family was. So we're starting to see glimpses that it may be that Ichabod is actually more interested in her money and her family's inheritance than he actually is in Katrina herself. And there's another example of this on page 40. So let's flip there. The second paragraph says, when he'd concluded his very pleasant visit, Ichabod headed home on foot, determined that someday these rich fields, these orchards loaded with fruit, would be his. So once again, we are seeing an example that he's imagining all of this wealth and all this prosperity and all this success is going to be his. And that is not based on his intrinsic motivation of his well-being or his peace. He wants to get the money and the power that comes along with that. So those are two examples of motivation in the text, and I would encourage you to take a peek at some other books you're reading and see if you can see motivation within those books in regards to the main characters. So just something to be thinking about is, why are characters doing things? Just like us, why are we motivated to do something? What is the reason or the cause behind that? Is it intrinsic or is it extrinsic? So I have a couple questions that I would like for you to journal about now. So grab your journal and a paper. And I have two questions today. The first one is, what are the two main things that Katrina Van Tassel is known for? What different things does she wear that demonstrate each of these? So grab your journal and write the answer to that one. The second one, and that's a green question, so you can go back to the text and find it. The second one is not a green question, so that means you can't just go to the text. You're going to have to think about what the text is saying and interpret that and write it in your own words. So the next question is, what does it mean on page 40 when it says, but it was one thing to imagine himself courting the rich and beautiful girl, and quite another thing to win her heart? So I want you to think about that very short paragraph and write what that means. What is the author, Washington Irving, telling you? So interpret that and rewrite it in your own words. And I cannot wait to see all of the hashtags Bookcast on Instagram. I'll be sharing those on my social media. If you're not following me, go ahead and do that so you can stay up to date with when the podcast is published and any other events that are going on. You can find me on Instagram, Elizabeth Langs, and you can also follow the podcast. So on Instagram, the podcast is Bookcast Podcast. And you can also find me on Facebook, Elizabeth Langs, and that way you'll be able to stay up to date and share things with me through social media. And with that, have an awesome day, and thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you later for chapter 4 of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Yeah, Bookcast, you ready? Yeah. Bookcast, where you can read a chapter a day, learn some vocabulary. Let's get started right away. We can break down the story elements. Let's learn. See, I can start it off, but then it's your turn. Tricky long words, we can do it, no problem. Wanna learn the definition? Yeah, we can solve it. We gon' have fun. cause reading is the best. So tune in if you're ready for a book cast. Yeah.